South Korea plunged into chaos with the sudden invasion from the north, an unexpected turn that threw the nation and its American allies into a harrowing retreat. Overwhelmed by the communist onslaught, the Allied forces faced an army of tens of thousands of infantry, artillery, and, critically, tanks, led by the Soviet-made T-34s, a tank that epitomized armored dominance on the battlefield. In stark contrast, the only immediate armored response from the U.S. Far East Command came in the form of the World War II-era M24 Chaffee. This compact light tank, tipping the scales at just over 18 tons and armed with a mere 75mm gun, stood as the solitary option to confront the enemy's advance. Designed primarily for reconnaissance and infantry support, the Chaffee, with its lighter armor and armament, was not suited for head-on clashes with the Soviet behemoths. On July 10, 1950, a decisive moment unfolded as a unit of Chaffees encountered the enemy's T-34 tanks for the first time. Leveraging their agility, the Chaffee crews went on the offensive. The initial exchange of fire saw the Chaffee's rounds bouncing harmlessly off the T-34's armor, but the American tanks pressed on, maneuvering to get within effective range. As the battle heated up, 2 Chaffees were hit and destroyed, a stark reminder of the risks they were taking. Then, in a moment teetering on the edge of disaster, as a T-34 lined up its shot on another Chaffee, an unexpected explosion changed everything. When the smoke began to clear, it was revealed that this was the result of a cunning flanking maneuver. The Chaffee's maneuverability and the crew's tactical ingenuity had turned the tables. Emerging from behind the enemy lines, the flanking Chaffees had caught the T-34s off guard. In the heat of battle, the Chaffee showed that age and power are not the sole determinants of effectiveness, revealing hidden aces through innovative tactics. When World War II broke out and the United States military joined the conflict in Europe, it deployed the M3 and M5 Stuart series of light tanks for reconnaissance. Although initially unreliable, the M3 quickly turned obsolete once it faced the Wehrmacht. And with good reason, its design dates back to the 1930s. The Stuart was equipped with a lackluster 37mm main gun, featured thin armor extremely ineffective against enemy shells and explosives, and to make it worse, a high silhouette that made it an easy target for the enemy. The Army began developing a replacement for the light tank in 1943. The result was the M24 Chaffee, nicknamed in honor of Major General Adna R. Chaffee Jr., the father of the armored force. The M24 Chaffee had a length of 18 feet, a width of 9 feet, a height of 9 feet, and an overall weight of 20 tons. It was powered by twin Cadillac 44 T-24 8-cylinder engines of 110 horsepower, each with a hydromatic transmission, comprising 8 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, allowing the vehicle to achieve a top speed of around 35 miles per hour with a maximum operational range of 100 miles. The crew of 5 comprised a commander, gunner, driver, loader, and co-driver. The men had access to the powerful 75mm cannon, one 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun, one ball-mounted 30 caliber Browning machine gun, one 30 caliber coaxial machine gun in the turret, and an M3 51mm smoke mortar. The first batches of M24s began to arrive at the European theater in late autumn 1944. By this point in the war, American armored personnel had already grown tired of the M5 light tank platform and were desperate for any replacements to fill the role. According to the testimony of an observer from the armored force visiting the 12th Armored Division, the American light tank companies armed with the M5 were, quote, so useless that they were often employed as anti-tank gun bait for the division's M4 Shermans. A few Stuarts were used for evacuation and resupply roles, but no American crew dared to use them in combat, as it often meant a one-way ticket. The first battalions to be fully armed with the Chaffee were the 744th and 759th, followed by the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions. Arming more units with the brand-new light tank was abruptly interrupted by the surprise Ardennes offensive launched by the Wehrmacht in December 1944. During the confused counter-operations, 2 M24s destined for the 744th ended up with the 740th, which was hurried to the combat zone on December 20th, near Stoumont and L'Église in Belgium, against the ruthless Kampfgruppe Piper. These were the first Chaffee tanks that saw actual combat during the war against one of the most effective armored units of the elite Waffen-SS. Shortly after, the rest of the 30 M24s charged against the enemy as the Battle of the Bulge extended and consumed the momentum of the Axis troops. Slowly but steadily, the M24 reached more units, but the demand was high and would not cease until the European conflict ended. Still, American logistics ensured that outdated Stuarts were phased out when the Chaffee tanks reached Allied lines. Given the light tank's novelty, its sloped armor and low silhouette made many American GIs confuse the M24 Chaffee with the German Panther. The physical comparisons with the German medium tank earned the Chaffee the nickname Panther Pup. To prevent these confusions over the war zone and to train new light tank crews on the M24, the Army started a new training tank program to familiarize the troops with the new vehicle. American tankers quickly familiarized themselves with the vehicle and were impressed by its capabilities, as it offered several advantages over the M5s and the heavier M4 Sherman. For example, the M24s were faster, more mobile, and more maneuverable than the M5 and the M4. They could easily traverse muddy roads, snowy terrain, and battle zones with scattered rubble. Moreover, tank crews praised the M24's telescopic sights and the ample room in the fighting compartment. Furthermore, the 75mm gun drastically improved over the lackluster 37mm gun of the M5 Stuart. Although it still lacked the punch to take the fight head-on against German Panzers, it was excellent for putting out of commission enemy armored vehicles, fortifications, and infantry or artillery emplacements. The Chaffee, though not designed for frontline combat, featured the innovative sloped armor popularized by the Germans, allowing it to absorb the impact of rounds that would otherwise result in a critical hit. Despite the improvements over the Stuart, the Chaffee stood no chance against the German Panzer IVs, the Panther medium tanks, and the battlefield behemoths that were the Tiger I and King Tiger. Each vehicle excelled at its role. For instance, the Chaffee was a light tank, while the Panther and the Tiger were developed for frontline combat. As such, they featured heavier armor and more powerful guns. The Chaffee featured armor that was, at most, over 25mm thick and armed with a 75mm gun. On the other side, the Panther was also armed with a 75mm gun and protected by a frontal sloped armor 110mm thick. An imposing Tiger I was equipped with an 88mm L56 gun and protected by up to 120mm thick frontal armor. The Panther's and Tiger's main guns could easily penetrate the M24's armor at most combat ranges, while the M24's 75mm gun would struggle to penetrate the frontal armor of either German tank. The M24 was not designed to engage enemy tanks of this caliber. Its primary roles were surveillance and support. The M24's best chance for survival against these opponents would be its superior mobility and speed, allowing it to avoid direct engagements, scout enemy positions, and relay information to friendly units capable of taking on the Panther and Tiger. In situations where avoidance was impossible, the Chaffee crews would need to use terrain, concealment, and any available tactical advantage to strike at the German tank's weaker side and rear armor. Still, the vehicle proved its reliability and triumphed where the M3 Stuart failed, excelling in its role, reconnaissance and infantry support. Exploiting its speed and maneuverability, American tankers made the most out of their M24s. The light tanks led scouting missions ahead of armored columns to detect hostile armored formations, artillery, and infantry emplacements hiding near towns, villages, and cities. Given its more powerful armor and armament, the M24s also screened advances and exploited breaches in German lines alongside the Allied infantry. The 75mm gun came in handy for destroying enemy strongholds. At the same time, the 50 caliber MG and its two 30 caliber Brownings were the perfect addition for neutralizing retreating foes or providing suppressive fire while American troops reached cover. Nonetheless, the M24 was imperfect and suffered the same faults as most light tanks from the period. Tank crews reported that while superior to the Stuart, its belly armor was still insufficient against enemy mines. American GIs also complained about the 50 caliber machine gun's placement in the captain's hatch and the insufficient power of the 75mm gun. Besides participating in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, the Chaffees were also deployed to push through the Rhineland. Others also went to Central Europe and Italy, serving with the 1st Armored Division's 81st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Besides the US forces, the British were the only Allied force that employed over 300 M24s through the Lend-Lease Agreement. No M24 Chaffee ever set foot in the Pacific during the war. The US Marines rejected the vehicle for service. The reason was simple. There was no need for light tanks against the Empire of Japan, as the reliable M4 Shermans were more than enough to assist the Leathernecks in combat. Following the end of the European conflict, the US Army consolidated constabulary units for occupation duties in Austria, Germany, and Japan. The light tanks proved the perfect vehicle for Japan, as they could easily traverse roads and bridges the Shermans could not. Besides a dozen Pershing heavy tanks, the M24 Chafees stationed in Japan were the only tanks the US Far East Command had available for immediate deployment after the sudden attack on South Korea by the North's Communist forces on June 25, 1950. All the available M24s were rushed to the front lines of the Korean Peninsula to support the 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division, trying to fend off the endless waves of North Korean troops. The first combat engagement of M24 Chaffees occurred on July 10, 1950, when several vehicles from A Company of the 78th Tank Battalion engaged a Soviet-made North Korean T-34 and destroyed it at the cost of losing 2. Costly engagements like this would become the norm for Chaffee tanks throughout the Korean War. Overall, the light tank would perform poorly against the North Korean T-34s, given the poor maintenance of the vehicles in Japan and the superior armor of the Soviet vehicle and its 76mm tank gun. Nonetheless, the M24s would manage to destroy over 10 enemy vehicles before heavier American tanks arrived on the battlefield to support them. Despite its strengths, the M24 Chaffee reached its combat limits during the Korean War, leading to its replacement the very same year the war in the peninsula ended. The reliable M24 almost reached a 10-year service with the American military. Still, it was caught in the Cold War transition period when the Soviet Union and the US were beginning to field heavier tanks that could inflict and receive more damage and serve in many different roles. All the Chaffees in American inventory were replaced by the M41 Walker Bulldog, another light tank with a 76mm gun tailored, like the M24, to excel at reconnaissance and infantry support operations. Nonetheless, the M24s still had a way to go and would see more combat during the Cold War as the French military purchased them to use in Indochina and Algeria. The French M24s were swiftly deployed to gain control of Vietnam and saw action in 1954 during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the French were ultimately overwhelmed and outnumbered by the Viet Minh troops. During the costly battle, 10 disassembled M24s were delivered by air to assist the French troops in engaging the Vietnamese rebels during the siege. Between December 1953 and May 1954, the French M24s fired over 15,000 shells against the attacking and entrenched rebel forces in the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. By the time the battle ended, the Chaffees were utterly worn out. Some eventually ended up serving with the Army of South Vietnam in the following years, fighting alongside the American forces that joined the conflict in the mid-1960s. Other NATO allies, such as Italy, Belgium, Norway, and Turkey, employed the M24 throughout the Cold War. The last M24 saw combat for the last time during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, where over 60 Pakistani M24s engaged Soviet-made Indian T-55s and were decisively destroyed. Overall, 30 nations were armed with the M24 throughout its life service. Despite superior improvement over the Stuart, the M24 was still plagued by the drawbacks of light tank designs from the era. Nonetheless, the M24 had a lengthy, effective service within its role with the American Army and its Cold War allies, leaving its mark in the history of light tank designs.